Witchcraft in Salem Village by John Fiske. In the year 1670, the provincial parliament of Normandy condemned a dozen women, young and old, to be burned at the stake. Their crime was attendance upon the witches' Sabbath. An appeal was taken to the crown, and Louis XIV was persuaded to spare their lives on condition that they should leave the kingdom and never return. Astonishment and indignation greeted this exercise of royal clemency, and the provincial parliament sent a petition to the king containing a grave remonstrance. Your parliament have thought it their duty on occasion of these crimes, the greatest which men can commit, to make you acquainted with the general and uniform feeling of the people of this province with regard to them, it being moreover a question in which are concerned the glory of God and the relief of your suffering subjects, who groan under their fears from the threats and menaces of this sort of persons. We humbly supplicate your majesty to reflect once more upon the extraordinary results which proceed from the malevolence of these people, on the loss of goods and chattels, and the deaths from unknown diseases, which are often the consequence of their menaces, all of which may easily be proved to your majesty's satisfaction by the records of various trials before your parliaments. It is pleasant to be able to add that Louis XIV was too well versed in the professional etiquette of royalty to withdraw a pardon which he had once granted, and so the poor women were saved from the flames. What we have especially to note is that the highest court of Normandy, representing the best legal knowledge of that province, in defining witchcraft as the infliction of disease or the destruction of property by unknown and mysterious means, describes it as the greatest of all crimes, and has no more doubt of its reality than burglary or highway robbery. This unquestioning belief in the reality of witchcraft has been shared by the whole human race, civilized and uncivilized alike, from prehistoric ages to the end of the 17th century. There are tribes of men with minds so little developed that travelers have doubted the existence of religious ideas among them, but none have been found so low as to not have some notion of witchcraft. Indeed, one of the most primitive and fundamental shapes which the relation of cause and effect takes in the savage mind is the assumed connection between disease or death and some malevolent personal agency. The conceptions of natural disease and natural death are attainable only by civilized minds. To the savage, who has scarcely an inkling of such a thing as laws of nature, all death is regarded as murder, either at the hands of a superhuman power that must be propitiated, or at the hands of some human being upon whom vengeance may be wreaked. The interpretation of disease is the same, and hence one of the chief occupations of medicine men and priests among the barbarous races is the detection and punishment of witches. Hence, among all the superstitions, or things that have stood over from primeval ages, the belief in witchcraft has been the most deeply rooted and the most tenacious of life. In all times and places, until quite lately, among the most advanced communities, the reality of witchcraft has been accepted without question, and scarcely any human belief is supported by so vast a quantity of recorded testimony. At the present day, among communities like our own, we may observe a wonderful change. Among educated people, the belief in witchcraft is practically extinct. It has not simply ceased to be taken seriously, but it has vanished from people's minds. We recognize it as one of the grotesque features in an Indian's theory of things, or perhaps we find it cropping out among the odds and ends of diabolism that the Negro mind retains from the old stock of African folklore, but we no longer associate such a belief with civilized men, and a good deal of historical study is needed to enable us to realize adequately its omnipresence only 2 centuries ago. What has caused this remarkable change in our mental attitude towards witchcraft? Surely not argument. Nobody has ever refuted the evidence that once seemed so conclusive in favor of the belief. For the most part, we should now regard that evidence as not worth the trouble of refuting. Some powerful cause has made our minds insuperably inhospitable to such sort of evidence. That cause is the gigantic development of physical science since the days of Newton and Descartes. The minds of civilized people have become familiar with the conception of natural law, and that conception has simply stifled the old superstition as clover chokes out weeds. It has been observed that the existence of evidence in favor of witchcraft closely depends upon the disposition to believe it, so that when the latter ceases, the former disappears. Accordingly, we find no difficulty in understanding the universality of the belief until quite modern times. The disposition to believe was one of the oldest inheritances of the human mind, while the capacity for estimating evidence in cases of physical causation is one of its very latest and most laborious acquisitions. In 1664, there was a witch trial at the Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk. The presiding justice was Sir Matthew Hale, one of the most eminent and learned of English judges. 2 aged widows, Amy Dunny and Rose Cullender, were indicted for bewitching 6 young girls and 1 baby boy. This infant was seized with fainting turns, and his mother, suspecting witchcraft, took counsel of a country doctor who told her to hang the child's crib blanket all day in the chimney corner, and if on taking it down at nightfall she should see anything strange there, she was not to be afraid of it, but to throw it into the fire. Well, when she was putting the baby to bed, she took down the blanket, and a big toad fell out and hopped about the hearth. "Oh, put it into the fire quick," she said to a boy present, who forthwith seized the poor toad with a pair of tongs and held it in the blaze. There was a flashing, as of powder, and a strange noise, and then the toad vanished. But that same evening, Amy Dunny, sitting by her own fireside, had her face all smirched and scorched. Of course, Amy was the toad, and it was natural that she should be vexed at such treatment, so that when the baby's sister suddenly sickened and died, and its mother grew lame enough to use crutches, it was all clearly due to Amy's diabolical arts. Absolute demonstration was reached when Amy was sentenced to death, for then her witch power ceased, and the lame woman forthwith threw away her crutches and walked briskly as anybody. The other afflicted children complained of griping pains and vomited crooked pins and 2-penny nails. In the courtroom, when Amy Dunny or Rose Cullender came near them, they threw their aprons over their heads and writhed in agony. It happened that among the magistrates present were some hard-headed Sadducees. Lord Cornwallis and Sir Edmund Bacon suspected these fits and torments of being a wicked sham. They blindfolded the girls and had other old women approach and touch them. The girls went off into fits every time without discriminating between Rose or Amy and the other women. But this trifling flaw in the case was nothing when set off against the weighty evidence of a witness who declared that Rose Cullender had given him hard words, and shortly afterwards his hay cart was stuck in passing through a gate. Another deposed that Amy Dunny had said, "That chimney of yours will be falling down one of these days." And so sure enough it did. After this, there could be no doubt in any reasonable mind that Rose had bewitched the cart, and Amy the chimney. The learned justice in his charge aimed a rebuke at the skepticism exhibited by some of the magistrates. He declared that the reality of witchcraft was not open to question, since it was expressly affirmed in Holy Writ, and provided for in the criminal codes of all nations. The jury took less than half an hour to agree upon their verdict of guilty. And next week, these two old dames were hanged at Cambridge, protesting their innocence with their last breath. Upon just such so-called evidence, more thousands of innocent persons than it will ever be possible to enumerate have been put to death under the forms of law. It is difficult to accept all the wholesale figures mentioned by old historians, yet the figures for which we have good authority are sufficiently dreadful. In general, we may regard it as probable that during the Middle Ages, executions for witchcraft occurred with much the same monotonous regularity as executions for murder and other felonies, but from time to time there were epidemics of terror when the number of victims was fearfully swelled. Now the famous bull of Pope Innocent VIII against witchcraft, published in 1484, marks the beginning of a new era in the history of the superstition. As literature and art have had their golden ages, so the 16th and 17th centuries were especially the sulphurous age of the witchcraft delusion. It was the period when the Church of Rome was engaged in a life and death struggle with heresy, and the obnoxious persons suspected of heresy could sometimes be destroyed by a charge of witchcraft when there was no other method of reaching them. Thus, the universal superstition was enlisted in the service of a militant and unscrupulous ecclesiastical organization with effects that were frightful. As it was understood that the diabolical crime of witchcraft was now to be stamped out once and for all, the evidences of it were naturally found in plenty. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1489, became the great textbook of the subject, and at no time since history began have the fires of hell been so often lighted upon earth as in the course of the next 2 centuries. We are told by Martin del Rio that in 1515, not less than 500 witches were executed in the single city of Geneva, and a certain inquisitor named Remigio boasted that in his district, in the north of Italy, within 15 years he had personally superintended the burning of more than 900 such criminals. In Scotland from 1560 to 1600, the average annual number of victims was 200, making a grim and ghastly total of 8,000 for 40 years. Or, to put it in another form, the executions averaged 4 each week in a population about equal to that of Massachusetts at present day. In 1597, that grotesque royal author, James VI, published at Edinburgh his treatise on demonology, in which he maintained that against so foul a crime as witchcraft, any sort of evidence is good enough, and the testimony of very young children or of persons of the vilest character ought on no account to be omitted.